You mentioned Alexei Navalny, and we want to talk about the protests right now, the major protests in Russia. Moscow police have arrested at least 237 people today alone outside a court hearing for the opposition figure, Alexei Navalny. A Russian judge is deciding whether to send him to prison for 3.5 years, stemming from a previous conviction for which he was given a suspended sentence. Outside the courthouse, protesters criticized the proceedings.
That's right.
The only possible opinion here is that this trial is a sham, like many other trials in Russia. This is a politically motivated case, obviously. The person was poisoned in Russia, but the crime is not under investigation. The person returned into Russia and have jailed him straight away and suing him, and the hearing was in Imki. Everything that is going on is a full-blown delusion, have nothing to do with justice.
The hundreds arrested just today are on top of the 5,100 people who were arrested over the weekend across Russia to call for the release of Navalny and to criticize the government, jailed since returning to Russia on January 17th after receiving medical care in Germany, as you mentioned, after being poisoned with the nerve agent in August. Navalny has accused Russian President Vladimir Putin of being behind the attack. Last week, he briefly spoke during a court proceeding.
I want to say one more time, you won't succeed in frightening us. In fact, we are the majority. You won't manage to frighten dozens of millions of people who were robbed by those in power, despite the fact that those people who are now under arrest faced hardships.
Well, Navalny has emerged as Russia's leading opposition figure, an anti-corruption campaigner. His political roots have links to right-wing nationalist and anti-immigrant causes. In 2007, expelled from a liberal party for his involvement in the annual far-right Russia March. He also once appeared in a video that compared Muslims in the North Caucasus to cockroaches. Joshua Yaffa, you're the Moscow correspondent for The New Yorker. You've been covering all of this. I'm wondering if you can talk about the latest. Who Navalny is, what it means that he's back, that he was poisoned. And just today when they said you didn't report back enough to the court, he said, I was in a coma.
That's right. The latest is that at this very moment, Navalny is waiting a decision from a Moscow court, which will determine whether or not he'll be sent to prison for 3.5 years, based off of facts from a case that you just mentioned. Formally, the Russian authorities are charging him with violating the terms of his parole for not appearing regularly at a police station as required. Of course, he didn't appear at the police station in Russia because he had been airlifted to Germany for medical care after being poisoned with the nerve agent Novichok. So a real Kafkaesque dark comedy of the absurd in a Moscow courtroom today. But the consequences are not funny, but in fact very real. And if the prosecutor gets his or her way, and really it's of course not a question of what the prosecutor wants or what the judge wants, but what the Kremlin decides and instructs the court to do, Navalny may well be sent to prison for 3.5 years. His statement to court today was very forceful, very powerful, very direct. He didn't so much address the legal minutiae of the case as the political context surrounding it, blaming Putin personally, suggesting that Putin could not tolerate the fact that not only did Navalny survive the poisoning attempt against his life in August, but then from his hospital bed and recovery and rehabilitation in Germany, investigated the assassination attempt against him, identified a number of officers in the FSB, Russia's main security service, who were involved in the attempt to kill him with poison. He even managed to get one of the FSB officers on the phone and record a conversation in which this FSB officer all but admitted to the plot. Navalny referenced all of these facts, said that Putin and the security officials around him were humiliated, out for revenge, and that is why he was being put on court today for having the boldness, the chutzpah, if you will, to return to Russia after having barely survived this attempt on his life, and ultimately saying that the attempt or the effort to put him in prison isn't actually an attempt to scare millions of Russians around the country, but, as Navalny said, calling on his supporters to continue their protests. You can't put the entire country in prison. So we're waiting any minute now the decision of this court. I think we'll learn a lot about the Kremlin's intentions and its mood surrounding Navalny and the protests. Do they decide, in fact, to send Navalny to prison for 3.5 years? Do they decide for some kind of de-escalation measure, like giving him house arrest? We should find out any minute now, but I think that will determine a lot about not only what the Kremlin is thinking, but how these events, and especially the protests, are likely to continue in the coming days.
And Joshua, I wanted to ask you, we've heard a lot about Navalny being an anti-corruption crusader, but it's my experience that all politicians who are out of power claim that those in power are corrupt. What more do we know about Navalny's political views? I mean, we know that he has espoused anti-Muslim racism or sentiments on many occasions, but what about his views, for instance, on the annexation of Crimea, on Russia's role in the Syrian civil war, or even more importantly, his view on what happened even before Putin came into power, the massive sell-off of public assets that occurred during the Yeltsin years, that to some extent Putin put a stop to.
Well, I'm not so sure that Putin put a stop to that corruption as so much nationalized effectively the corruption and put it under the control of himself and figures from his inner circle, creating a new oligarchy, not so much disrupting or dismantling the oligarchy of the 90s, but creating a new alternative oligarchy that was loyal to him and benefited from their proximity to him and owed their wealth to him. As to Navalny himself and what kind of figure he is, first and foremost, he's a politician, which means on the one hand, he can be vague when politically expedient, and he can avoid taking sharp, controversial positions that would alienate some portion of his audience or potential audience. He can also change his mind and float or try and use various political tendencies and moods in the country at the time to his advantage. That seems to be the case with his flirtation with Russian nationalism you mentioned from the mid-2000s. I think that's the same thing that is at work in his rather ambiguous comments about the annexation of Crimea. He certainly does not suggest that if he were to become president, Russia would return Crimea to Ukraine tomorrow. In fact, quite the opposite.
We have 15 seconds, Joshua.
I think that all that says that we'll only know what sort of politician Navalny is when he's actually allowed to participate in formal politics. So far, he's been kept off the ballot, was not allowed to run for president in 2008.